So welcome to everyone who's participating in this live webinar and for the teachers who are listening to the recording. My name is Kerry O'Connor and I'm pleased to be able to host this suite of 5 free teacher webinars as a collaboration between MIFF and MLTAV for the MIFF 2020 Schools program. This suite of webinars has been designed specifically for languages teachers to provide enough information for teachers to make an informed choice about whether the films are appropriate for your cohort of students. And the webinar itself offers a rich and deep analysis of the film, thanks to our film specialist extraordinaire, Josh Nelson, and our Japanese language expert Kylie Farmer will also provide lots of information. We'll focus on the language and cultural aspects of the film, but also give ideas of how to link different aspects to the Victorian curriculum. Collectively, it's a package that provides thoughts, tips and ideas how languages teachers can work with their students in preparation for seeing the film and after. But before I hand over to the presenters, I will share some important information about this year's program. Due to the unprecedented circumstances we're all navigating this year, Kate Fitzpatrick, who's the programmer of this particular suite of films, and the MIFF team have worked tirelessly and really displayed exceptional commitment, dedication and determination to ensure that the schools program still be offered this year despite obvious challenges. So for that, I'd like to sincerely thank them. Given 2020 is a virtual program, MIFF have been able to open it up to schools nationally, as well as offer access to the films free, which is amazing and generous. Having said that, I need to stress that there are booking limits. So each film has a limited number of access licenses, and I'm just going to give a bit of an example about that. So in a face-to-face classroom, a teacher who accesses the film to show the students in the classroom gets 1 license. Given the virtual setting, if a teacher's in one space, teachers or students are all in their own spaces, then the licenses required for that is 1 for the teacher and 1 individual license for each of the students. So you can see how that does certainly add up quickly. So with this in mind, we need to be very mindful of each other. Schools that register really large bookings will limit access to other schools. So we want to be able to open this up as widely as possible. And in particular, one of the concepts is to enable access to regional schools and rural and regional schools, given just purely from their geographical restrictions that may have prevented them from participating in the program in past years. So just a bit of a call out, if you are from a school that has made a very large booking so far for this particular film, you may want to have a think about that, revisit it, and perhaps get in touch with the MIFF booking office to discuss that, because it is really important before making a booking that we recommend that you watch these webinars, because you really need to make you will get enough information to make an informed decision about the appropriateness of the film for your students. So with that in mind, I must inform you that this Japanese film, Bento, Harassment, is already booked out. So that is something that I've been speaking to. We realised that yesterday, well, MIFF realised that yesterday, because we had teachers saying exactly what some of the teachers in the chat screen are saying. Kate Fitzpatrick is working extremely hard to open up more access. However, no promises can be made at this stage. One of the things is the uncertainty around, Louise, yes, you wanted to watch a webinar first, which is what we recommend that you do. So what we are saying is that because it's uncertain around whether in September, because the access to the films is from the 3rd to the 17th of September. So we do not know at this stage whether we're going to be back in Victoria, remote learning or face-to-face. That's going to have a huge impact on the number of licenses for the different bookings. So what we're saying in consultation with MIFF yesterday is that when you go on to register for this film at the moment, you won't see it because it's booked out. However, what you can do, and we recommend that you do this, is that you email the MIFF booking office on boxoffice@ miff.com.au. I'll actually present that on the last slide as well, to make sure that you express an interest in being contacted in the case that there are additional places or licenses become available. So please make sure you do that, because it is a bit uncertain about that at this time. So I'm conscious of the time I've taken up so far, but you can have questions directed to Josh, Kylie, or myself about the registration process at the end. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Josh, who will hand over to Kylie. I'll come back at the end to just invite questions and run over some logistical information and provide some links for you. So without further ado, Josh, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Kylie. And also thank you and welcome to all our live participants and those who are watching this via the archived version. As Kerry mentioned at the beginning there, the first part of this webinar presentation will focus on the filmic aspects and focusing on the visual literacy and really suggesting some pathways and strategies for approaching this film in a classroom, a virtual classroom or an actual classroom setting. And suggesting possible sort of ways of integrating the visual analysis of this film together with both the language and the cultural aspects that Kylie is going to discuss. And obviously that is sort of the, I guess, the primary focus for from where a lot of you are coming from. But I think this aspect of visual literacy is important. And it's important not just in the context of language studies and language learning, but obviously in other subjects within the VCAR and VCE. So English, EAL, literature, media studies, particularly where the skills, those visual literacy skills, become increasingly important in the assessment for year 11 and year 12. Before I take a deep dive into Bento harassment, it's probably worth giving you a brief synopsis. And I should actually mention this is going to be a largely, to the best of my ability, spoiler-free presentation. The film itself is set on the island of Hachijo, which is in the Kylie will correct me if I get this wrong, but it's in the Tokyo ward, and there's quite a lengthy discussion of how Hachijo fits in relation to Tokyo within the film, but it focuses on a mother-daughter relationship on this island. The father in the family has passed away, the elder sister has moved out, and the film really revolves around the conflict that ensues between this mother and daughter, which emerges as she goes off to high school. And the mother, in order to, I guess, prompt a dialogue between the pair, starts sending her off with these kyaruben, these character bentos, quite elaborate character bentos, as you will soon see, to sort of provoke her child into an open discussion. And this process, which the film compresses quite cleverly, runs the gamut of high school through to her graduation. So the trailer is there for you to watch online. Let's just focus on the film techniques briefly. So what I've been saying in these MIFF schools webinars for a number of years, and this is something how I approach film in the classroom context as well, particularly for younger students, perhaps if you're considering taking students in years 9 or 10 who may not have had a lot of exposure to film analysis or media analysis in the classroom context, I think it's important that you establish some basic terminology, so that when they're watching the film, they're actively looking to see how the filmmaker is constructing meaning through the visual language, through those filmic techniques. And again, I think it could be as simple as establishing some basic terms of cinematography. For example, what is a close-up shot? What is a wide-angle shot? How are these shots typically used by filmmakers? What is their sort of function in terms of character or themes, or camera movement, for example? A key term for film analysis is mise en scène, and I'll come back to these in relation to this specific film in more detail in just a moment. But the use of production design, so props, costumes, lighting, composition, the position of actors within the frame, it's all part of the mise en scène. Other considerations such as sound, music, dialogue, voiceover, the structural elements or story elements such as genre, which I'll touch on in just a moment, editing, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And I really think it's important that students do have an awareness of those before they go into the screening. And again, what I've suggested in previous years is perhaps assigning specific students or groups of students to look for certain types of techniques and then report back afterwards. and to sort of describe how the filmmaker was using them or where and why that was important. So just broadly speaking, some of the themes that I'll touch on, one of the strengths of Bento Harassment as a teachable text or a teaching text is it touches on a number of different aspects, particularly in terms of Japanese culture. So obviously, I sort of flagged this in the beginning in that synopsis, food is crucially important. This is a film, I think it's fair to say, is obsessed with food to a degree. I wouldn't watch this film on an empty stomach. That's also something I think it's worth pointing out. The film also touches on family, intergenerational conflict, grief and isolation. I mentioned that that Kaori, the mother figure, her husband's passed away. So obviously the Futaba, that the younger daughter's father has passed away. And there's another family with a single parent family that's sort of suffering through grief as well. Themes of time, or the motif of time, responsibility and ambitions. There's a wonderful contrast that's established between rural Japan versus urban Japan. And obviously things like traditions and customs, the function of technology, the way in which imagination and fantasy plays out in this film. It's a highly stylistic film in terms of an excess of style at certain points. And also in terms of gender roles and expectations. So there is a kind of a breadth of themes to discuss within a classroom context, which I think is really useful. In terms of positioning the film within those story blocks or story tropes, often I find it's useful, again, for younger students who may not have seen, for example, many Japanese films or films of this ilk, to try and get them to articulate what was familiar about the storytelling. What other films did it recall, connected to their own viewing habits, or maybe even points of difference to their own viewing habits. So in terms of trying to position this film within a genre, it's interesting because I'm kind of playing word games here, but I describe it as a family dramedy because it's a family film and it has elements of drama, but also certainly some comedic aspects as well. So crossing over really between the melodrama, the comedy and coming of age genres sort of melded into a single focus. And that is really playing on or focusing upon the figure of the maternal figure, the character of Kaori, and through this mother-daughter relationship. It's also, I think, quite a light-hearted exploration of Japanese cultural customs and traditions, food, school, popular culture, for example, and also the deeper themes that lie beneath that, issues of responsibility, expectation, ambition surrounding work and family. And certainly these are things I think that even students in the middle of high school, particularly towards year 11 and 12, can start to identify with and voice their own expectations of. In terms of similar themed films, to give you an idea, I focused on 3 Japanese films. Rinko's Restaurant, it's not a widely seen film, but I think it's an interesting one. It focuses on a mother-daughter relationship. The daughter returns to her mother's hometown, establishes a restaurant. She has a very tense relationship with her mother. And this restaurant has the unique aspect that she creates these incredible meals, but it's only for one customer or one group of customers per night. So again, family and food connecting there. Birthday Cards, another mother-daughter Japanese film. The mother is deceased, so there's a sort of another similarity with this film. And the mother has written birthday cards to her daughter in advance. So every year there's a sort of that connection between mother and daughter is being explored. And a film that was on the MIFF Schools program, I think not last year, the year before, Okozin, an animation about an orphan who comes to an inn in rural Japan and finds she has a talent for cooking for the guests. So again, grief, isolation, family and food. These seem to be recurrent themes in a number of Japanese films. So diving into the film techniques that I flagged at the beginning. And again, starting really basic. I think if students can go in having an understanding of the function of a close-up or a wide angle and being able to identify them, then they're off to a good start. Really what you're after in terms of that classroom discussion and feedback is for the students to articulate how a close-up is used, or to try and put themselves in the position of the filmmaker. Why would they have used this particular shot at this particular sequence or scene? And here we have a close-up at a highly emotional moment with the character of Futaba, the younger daughter. And also the other way that close-ups are used in this film is to highlight the intricacy of these bento creations, that the mother is there. And then you get quite an extreme close-up where we're having the eyes placed on sort of sausage creation. And then the opposite, the expansive wide angle shots. So the nature and the rural setting is really crucial here, the island setting of Hachijo, that we get repeatedly through these inserts of the wide angle shots. But also, again, thinking about character, how these shots relate back to the sort of the emotional drama at the core of the film. And here we have a shot of Futaba shot from behind, eating her lunch at school in isolation. And again, I think it says a lot about her character at that particular moment within the film. So ideally, you'd be asking students, why do you think the filmmaker has chosen to frame her or use this particular shot at that moment? The other aspect in terms of character and the camera work is composition. And I touched on this in the synopsis when I've suggested there's a conflict at the heart of this film between mother and daughter, sort of irreconcilable difference and this silence that exists between them. And again, that's not just there within the dialogue or the lack of dialogue, as it might be, but through the composition. And you'll notice in these top two images, the way it uses foreground, background to really emphasize that disconnect between the two characters. And here we have on the left-hand side, we have Kaori in the background and Futaba in the foreground, and that's reversed in other shots within the film. But also the way the film plays with angles. So on this lower left image, the use of the low angle shot here at this key emotional dramatic moment between the pair, where we have the low angle shot, which often is used to exaggerate a sense of authority or a status when we film a character from below looking up. But in this context, I think the effect is slightly different, and that is to emphasize, I guess, the claustrophobic atmosphere within the residence and the relationship between these two characters. And the other aspect of composition, which you'll see repeated throughout the film, is the way the filmmaker uses frames within the frame. For that similar effect, you'll notice that the reverse shot here of Kaori as she's sort of cleaning up a mess on the floor, and she's framed both with the door frame on the far right of frame, but also the use of those beams either side of her within there. Sense of the walls kind of closing in on her. Lighting is another crucial aspect. For the most part, I would have said this film is probably quite deliberately so overlit. A lot of external shots, a lot of use of natural lighting. And I've tended to select some contrasts here just so you can get a sense of the sophistication within the use of lighting. But again, the emotional content, how is lighting used? How does it reflect on themes or character? So the image on the top left, where we get Futaba eating by herself, and she's starting to come around, it's not really a spoiler, come around to the idea of her mum's dedication to her through these bento creations. And then the contrast, of course, is the settings within the interior. So again, we have a shot within the residence. Look at the way the lighting sort of focuses just on the two of them in this quite emotional moment. The camera is both sort of retreating from them. So again, we have the use of the frame within a frame composition. It's boxed in, but the light is sort of shining around them. There's almost a sense of hope at this moment within the narrative for their relationship. And then you get the contrast in those lower images, the use of darkness, the way the characters almost become a silhouette, and the image on the lower left, I won't give away where it is, but again, notice that this is a key emotional moment, the use of that same sort of style of composition with the frame within a frame. So recurring motifs in that visual language is really strong throughout this film. I tell students that mise-en-scène is the nuts and bolts of film analysis. So I say to them, if we were to stop this film at any point within any scene or sequence, what do we see? What does it tell us about character and themes? If we were to know nothing else about the people in this narrative, what can we presume about their lives and their situation just from the visual design, the use of props, costumes, lighting, composition, and so on. And I think you get a perfect example in the contrast between the characters' residences. We have the character of Kaori, who I've mentioned. For the most part, it's an incredibly neat and orderly residence, which reflects aspects of her character. And the contrast is Shinsuke, who's based in Tokyo, and he's a single father. His wife has passed away and he's raising his young son. And then you get the chaos of his residence. And again, I think that's reflected in their relationship. And there's some small details within the mise-en-scène that I think is quite telling. The pink sweater, which you see in the lower right image, draped or adorning the chair that sits directly between the figures. I'm almost certain, I think it's quite obvious that it's the wife's sweater. So the suggestion is through the visual language, without actually making deliberate reference to that piece of costuming, that her presence sort of still lingers. She's still there between them. And of course, there's a kind of chaos that's left through her absence. And one other little detail, because I think there's some sort of touching little details in this film, but the lower left image, one of Kaori's two jobs is, maybe Kylie can clarify this, it seems to be like a a bakery or a kind of cookie store or somewhere that makes maybe omiyage. We have the design of the shop is sort of almost anthropomorphized. It's almost, it sort of has these human qualities, and the eyebrows that we seem to have over the windows actually appear at that moment. They're normally flat, and then suddenly she gets a phone call from her daughter, and it's almost as if the external world is changed through this interaction. So again, the way the filmmaker plays with the visual design frequently reflects deliberately back to characters and what they're going through, and themes of home, work, family, and grief. I mentioned food at the beginning. There's a lot of food within this film, and food seems to be the conduit for a number of other themes. It's the suggestion that binds the characters, or a number of the conflicts. If we can just duck back just briefly. So you have the intricacy of the bentos that Kaori creates. There's the recurring dish of the omuraisu. You have the customs, the itadakimasu, and the significance or the connection between food and family, and the way food becomes that catalyst for not only creative expression, but the response to loss and grief. And one of my favorite moments in the film, you'll notice the image on the bottom left here, we have the kind of the food as revenge at a particular humorous moment within the film, where rather than getting these elaborate meals, Kaori cooks or roasts taro in the backyard. And I won't spoil it for you, but it's one of my favorite moments within the film. Let's just duck forward to the next food. So the other aspect of food, I think, is fascinating to focus on. I think students will get a lot out of this. It's certainly a prompt for lots of other discussions that Bento harassment raises within the narrative, is the significance of these Chiaro-ben, these character de Bento, and the questions it may prompt in terms of the significance of popular culture within Japanese life, and also aspects of consumerism, aspects of sort of commodification, popular culture, advertising, products, because as Kaori creates this immense number of these creations that she sends her daughter off with for lunch every day, the characters involved within that, there's a number of in-references, I think, which might be useful to talk about, raises these kind of connections where the food becomes a sort of a nexus point for these questions about Japanese culture. And also the fact that this is a teenager in her final years of high school, and she's taking these often quite stylized bento that I guess would be more age appropriate to youngsters within the film. A couple of aspects that I thought would be worth touching on, and certainly a follow-up in a classroom context if students weren't aware of it. There's a reference to Ringu, the Ringu films with the character of Sadako that we get in the lunchbox creation in the top right image, which comes to life. And the mother replaces the figure of Sadako as this creation comes to life. And also another minor reference, which again speaks to the level of detail within the film. Kaori is wearing on her apron, and there in the middle left image, the Andy Warhol a Campbell soup can. And again, the references to food as art as she's creating these food as art is quite a tongue-in-cheek and a pointed reference. I think the motif of time is also a fascinating one, not just in terms of the time it takes for her to create these immaculate kind of bento boxes, but also the question, or the way this motif of time that runs throughout the film suggests aspects of Japanese cultural life and the way it's regimented, and the kind of contrast between, say, Kaori's understanding of time, which is regimented by her parental responsibilities and then the two jobs that she works. And also that's sort of mirrored in Shinsuke, the character of Shinsuke's relationship to, time with his son as well. And I think it could be worth exploring how the cultural aspects of time, and that, I guess, that regimentation of time that the film seems to be suggesting, how is that similar or different to an Australian cultural understanding of time? So again, connecting the issues within this film to the students' own experiences of their own culture. I think gender is always, I find, particularly for year 11 and 12 students, sort of a fruitful topic of discussion, particularly in a film like this, where you have two single parents who are seemingly trying to negotiate the roles of breadwinner and emotional support for their children as well. And of course, it's quite fascinating the way we get the division between these two roles and the doubt that both these parents seem to have about whether they are living up to their prescribed gender roles or responsibilities within the film in either Hachijo or in Tokyo. And the reference there to Kaori growing some horns, one of a number of instances within the film where we get this sort of excess of style is quite fascinating. The fact she works 2 jobs. And there's a sequence in Tokyo, which I think is a useful prompt for discussion, where Futaba attends an interview and have the sort of 4 salarymen grilling her about why she wants this role. I think it's, particularly from a Western perspective, I think it's fascinating to consider the gender relationships and hierarchy that are being played out in that sequence, and perhaps reflective of broader issues within Japanese culture. I've mentioned the stylistic aspects within the film a couple of times. I do think it's interesting, and it's something students could consider, is why or how the filmmakers try to differentiate between the private and the public aspects of character, and whether that says something about just these individual characters and the way they try and keep things to themselves. And obviously the character of Futaba is silent for much of this film, particularly in relation to her mother, or whether this speaks to something broader within Japanese culture. But we get these moments of excess where the hidden truths or the hidden desires or anxieties or fears of these characters are expressed in these excessive ways. And we see that when Kaori is describing to her friends or customers at the izakaya she works in the evening about her daughter won't look, won't speak, won't listen. We get Futaba sitting alone, and we get her expressing her kind of innermost thoughts within a diary, which sort of starts to manifest on screen through these animation sequences, and also the way in which the filmmaker uses on-screen text as well to kind of give voice to these hidden thoughts. Certainly something to consider. Last couple of slides, if we can jump ahead, Kerry. Technology, I think it's always a good prompt, particularly for students who are glued to their phones, even more so now since we're often teaching remotely. So the function of technology has taken on an even greater significance in our day-to-day lives. I think this film is a useful prompt to a discussion of how technology impacts our lives. Does it distance us from other people and our loved ones, or does it connect them? Does it bring them closer? How is it contrasted with other forms of communication within the film? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. It's one of the interesting aspects about this film, because I think it would be easy to interpret it both ways, particularly for a character who's isolated in this island context. And again, the connection that develops between Kaori and Shinsuke and his son through the internet, through this blog where she starts posting her Kyaruben, becomes more and more important over the course of the film. But the handwritten letter is still there towards the end. I think it takes on a heightened significance in the context of this technological world. Last couple of slides and I'll hand over to Kylie. Hachijo, where the film takes place, I think is a perfect prompt to look at the importance of setting within the film. How does the fact that this is not a film taking place in typical urban Tokyo, where a number of films are set, and certainly students might be more familiar with that type of setting. And there's a wonderful sequence where the film stops and Kaori narrates her home and all these certain factoids about the home and the people who live there. And including facts such as the fact we say hello, we love to say welcome, with the inference that maybe this is very different to Tokyo. So again, the film sets up an interesting contrast between these two worlds. And of course, the character of Futaba is sort of caught in the middle of these two worlds to a degree. So a prompt for questions about culture and traditions. And there's a number on show within the film, from dancing, taiko, drumming, references to the shrine, the father that we see within the household, and the baths at New Year's. I'll let Kylie touch on these in more depth. And the ending, without giving anything away, I think it's important to consider, what does the filmmaker want us to take away, or what does the ending reflect on some of the themes we've discussed in terms of family, in terms of responsibility, ambition, work, the mother-daughter relationship? How has it evolved over the course of the film? Does the film offer a positive message in terms of the relationship of the inhabitants of the island to, say, urban culture? Are the traditions of the island going to persist, or is there a sense that maybe they're on the wane? And I would also strongly suggest, if you do watch this film, stay to the end of the credits. No, there's not a Marvel. Samuel L. Jackson doesn't turn up at the end, but there is an important moment which I think some people could miss if they leave mid-credits. And that is all I will say. And with that, I will hand over to Kylie to talk about the language and cultural aspects.
Thanks so much, Josh. And I just love the insights that you bring into Japanese culture through the things that you've selected there as well. And I just always fascinated listening to the insights you bring from film and language and culture. So hoping I can continue that. And it's lovely to see lots of familiar names in this webinar today. So yeah, I hope to be able to share with you some of my thoughts in terms of the application of this film into the classrooms. I am wondering your thoughts, having listened and seen Josh's insights, how you think that this might be suiting your students. And I can see many of you as secondary teachers, not sure about some may also be primary. And I know when I first thought about the film and saw that it was suitable for ages 10 and plus in terms of the rating of the film, I thought, okay, I can see this being a lovely unit where we're connecting with Kyaraben and beautiful making, you know, we often in the language teacher Facebook groups and those kind of things see images of great ideas that people have made in creating Kyaraben in language classrooms, and lots of language related to it. But I guess I actually chose to watch the film with my Year 9 daughter to get her perspective in terms of suitability into the classroom. And I thought, actually, there's some quite heavy content, and also the pace of the film. I wonder if it was to be a, for example, a Year 7 group of students who may or may not be completely into Japanese language and culture. I'm not sure how engaging it would be because of the pace and some of the heavy relationship kind of things that are going on. I feel like, and I really want to be quite honest, because I know I wouldn't want to be in a classroom and perhaps the choice of film not quite suiting my students. So I guess that's my initial thoughts were that it's probably more suited to, as Josh was mentioning, like the Year 10, 11, 12 level. This year for our Year 11, 12s has been pretty tricky, and I'm not sure how much flexibility in terms of the time available for doing these extra and lovely things. I guess that's something to consider, and it may be that it's a useful opportunity for students to connect with some of the viewing elements of the Year 11, 12 curriculum. And Kerry, I'm just wondering if you can perhaps turn on my video for me, or allow me to, because I just want to show something that I thought, if I was showing it with Year 11, 12s, this is something that might be quite nice to do with the students. Now I can't see myself here, so I'm just going to hold this up to my video and see if you can see that. A lot of characters come through in the creation, and so I've just used some sliced cheese and some nori, sheets of nori, and I just imagined students at Year 10, 11, 12 maybe practicing their characters as they're watching the movie. Now, I don't know what Josh would approve of that, but I would perhaps be missing some of the key aspects of the filming and those elements that he really shared so beautifully. But I just thought, with our students today who can be maybe better focused if they're multitasking, perhaps. I just thought it's an idea and brings in the language. So if there was kanji for those senior students to be practicing, perhaps they're creating them out of nori, and it does connect nicely with the curriculum. So, sorry, with the content of the film. In talking about the curriculum links that we've made in these next few slides about the language elements that we could consider in connection to the film, I have explicitly referenced the Year 9, 10 Victorian curriculum for Japanese, thinking about the Year 7 to 10 pathway. It's very similar to the Australian curriculum. So for anybody in other states and territories who this year for the first time are also able to access these films, this would be very similar content to the Year 10's programs equivalents in other states and territories, I'm sure. So we'll move along. Thanks, Kerry, if you can move along. In terms of the framework that we use to help us think about the language elements of the film, we use the NICE framework. We encourage students to be noticing elements of language and culture. We're thinking about interpreting those, in relation to the film elements that Josh has mentioned, but also in terms of the intercultural understandings that are building. We also can think about then what's the creation, what are students able to do based on what they've seen, what's some creative applications beyond the film, and then some reflective evaluative opportunities following the viewing of the film. So in terms of noticing, I think it would be particularly helpful for students to have a sense of the plain and polite forms of language for Japanese. So as this film is very much set in the home and in friend, peer group settings, it's a lot of plain form that's used, and quite very, very casual and quick, chatting amongst friends. So in terms of seeing any desmas kind of forms of language, it's not going to be there so much. So something for students to be aware of. And noticing who's using what kind of language with who. So you can, some elements to think about prior and then others for after. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat screen as well. So if you have got questions, I'm happy to follow up on those too. In terms of cultural elements, there'll be quite a few things I think that for students will be helpful for them to be encouraged to notice. We know when we're wanting to build students' intercultural understandings that we really want to help them to notice what's the things that you liked, what's the things that you perhaps didn't like, or that you were surprised by or interested in. And many of those elements that Josh mentioned, such as the gender roles or the family expectations, and those elements are quite key and will come up through the film. So I think suggesting that students have a way of taking notes about those elements that they see as they're watching the film, and then following the film coming back to chat about some of those things that they noticed. There could be some useful things for the Year 11, 12s, or even Year 10s preparing for 11, 12s for those detailed study kind of aspects as well. So very contemporary cultural insights that are there. Thanks, Kerry. In terms of starting to interpret and create, you can see that little image in the top left where I wonder what students might say about this, whether that's something that happens in their household where they text their mum even though they may be in the same room as each other. Possibly happens here, and I think that's something that it's nice to see the similarities in cultures and teams and communication techniques that are happening in young people. And so talking to students about being able to text in Japanese and how you could perhaps even set a task that involves students using that text language, brief single words. So in this one, it's talking, she wants a lift to school and she's saying it's raining. And then, so just furu, furu, furanai, not raining, it's okay. So some of those, very typical text kind of conversations that revolve around very simple, or not simple, but limited language use. So again, another opportunity to maybe bring that out of the film with students creating some text conversations. Subtitling in the film is interesting, and I know it's something that is a great conversation to have with students, because sometimes, and there might even be things that you ask them to really take note of, is if they noticed something in particular in the film that wasn't necessarily translated as they might expect it to be. So having knowledge of Japanese language, the students may notice some things that they were thinking, and you know, it's quite tough and revolves around a fair bit of needing a fair bit of language, but even as a teacher you might be able to pause, and that's a beauty of being able to watch it in your own classrooms this year, or whether it be face-to-face as well, or remote. If you pause it on a particular scene and perhaps unpack that with the students while you're watching, so that there might be something you notice in terms of subtitling, and that, you know, it doesn't quite translate the same way in English as what the meaning is in a when you have an understanding of Japanese. So that's a great element always in watching films with subtitles, and really being able to elicit the language and the culture that may be embedded and may not translate. And that's always something that's in the curriculum that sometimes can be tricky to think of examples of how to explore that with students. So great chance there. Some of the activities that, you know, these could apply to any types of films that students go to see, but if you are thinking about films and what students want to, what their favourite films are, you know, you can do surveys and get data around the class of, you know, favourite films, what films are the top 10, what's our class's top 10 movies. Then they may also, if there's a sister school that you can connect with, what's the favourite movies for the students at their sister school, and look if there's similarities in Disney, or whether students from the sister school have even seen this movie as well. So there's some nice connections you could make there. Some ideas to share there. Another thing I really like to bring students opportunities to really apply their expertise in using language for purpose. So if there's perhaps a class film blog where students are writing about their favourite film, and it could be about this film, or what was their favourite part about this film, if they're suggesting that others might want to watch it, why, what was the elements of the film that they enjoyed, what kind of audience do they think it would suit, who's going to like that film. So these are other ways that you could take the film further into the languages classroom in writing a blog piece about the film, or about another favourite film of the students. So always, if there are brave teachers who want to engage their kids in film making, even, I know some teachers do that, and there's obviously some connections that you can apply there. I think in terms of evaluating, it's really important to give students that moment to reflect and think about how their experience of watching film was with their knowledge of Japanese language and culture. You know, how were they able to understand it maybe on a deeper level, or have a greater understanding of some of the things that were happening in the film, that they are really only able to have those insights because of their understanding of the Japanese language, how the language operates, and how it allows them to access the culture in a deeper way than perhaps just relying on the English subtitles that may not share the full picture. So encouraging students to think about their understandings of Japanese culture that come through the film as well, and the elements that are included. There is modern and traditional culture that come through the caravan. You know, how would the students feel if their parents packed them a lunch like that? Some of them would be like, I'd love it if my mum would pack a lunch, but oh, no way, that's so embarrassing. Like, I would just feel like her, that my mum would pack a Japanese lunch, and that's like I got in grade 1, and that's just so embarrassing. So, you know, I think there's some really nice ways that the students can reflect and identify with the character, the main character, and bring their understanding of language and culture to that as well. So I think there's been a lot of information covered. I hope that's helpful to give you some insights into choosing the students that you may find this film for, suitable for, in terms of their engagement, their language, their cultural insights that come through, and of course the many elements of the film understandings in general, as Josh shared. So happy to answer questions in the chat, and I know Kerry's got information to share here about the registration and access. So thanks everyone, and great to see you online.
Thank you so much, Josh and Kylie. That was fantastic. I know from seeing the film myself that my kids, who are actually 19 and 21, we've got a plan for this weekend. We're going to make a bento box, which I just find to be extraordinary as a parent, spending that much time making a lunch rather than a quick slap together sandwich. I was astounded. I thought it was fantastic. So just a couple of additional pieces of information before I open it up to questions, because there may be some questions about this in terms of access. So the certificate of participation for 1 hour PL time for attending this live webinar, also for the people watching the recorded version. If you fill out a few brief questions, won't take long, I'll actually be able to customize a certificate of participation to email to you. MIFF, in terms of registering for the films, this is the MIFF link to the registration online form. So as I said, there's quite a few people that have joined throughout the presentation and didn't get to hear the introduction. So I'm going to be very brief with this, because I will send you all an email tonight with that link to the online survey and with a link to the recording of the webinar. So you may like to listen to the full introduction again, where I give a lot more detail. But currently this film is completely booked out. There is a limit of licenses in terms of virtual access. What we are recommending, and MIFF are working very hard in the background to try and open up that access. There is no guarantee of that at the moment, but given the uncertainty around the timing of you being able to watch these films is between the 3rd and the 17th of September. So other states are face-to-face learning, but in Victoria, where we have a uncertainty at the moment for that time, whether it will be face-to-face or virtual, there is also some uncertainty around that as to how many licenses will be required. So if you try to register for this film and you can't see the link, which I know a couple of people have said in the chat screen, I strongly recommend that you email the box office at MIFF. The email address is up there with point 3 to express an interest to be contacted should an opening becomes available. So please do that, because things can change, and certainly depending on whether it's remote or face-to-face during that time, things can change. A little bit of information about access, because I know I've been getting a lot of questions about this, is when you do register for the film, if you are accepted, then you are provided with a link to the film. You have a 48-hour window to view that film. So it's a little bit like if you hire a movie via Apple TV or something like that. From the time you click play, you have 48 hours to watch that film, and within that 48-hour window, you can watch it as many times as you need. So that actually is very interesting and very different, because in a normal year, when you take your students to see the film in ACME, then you all see it together. You have this preparation information from the webinar, but this actually opens up an opportunity for teachers that you could watch it first. You could look at the webinar, look at the tips that Josh and Kylie have given you, come up with your own ideas and do some screenshots and kind of things. Streaming is recommended via Ethernet connection rather than Wi-Fi. That's going to be, of course, different depending on whether it's face-to-face or virtual, but as with anything, an Ethernet connection in terms of reliability and internet speed is always a preference over Wi-Fi. Some people have issues with it, some won't. Registration access inquiries are directed to MIFF. They completely control the registration of the film. So again, there's the box office at miff.com.au email. Any questions that you have about these teacher webinars, or perhaps the certificates, anything like that, please feel free to contact me at the MLTAV office. Very happy to help. So we'll spend the last several minutes with anybody who has any questions for Josh or Kylie or myself in terms of registration access. So please feel free to either type in the chat screen if you're having any issues with putting your microphone on, and otherwise, turn your microphone off and we'd be very happy to have a chat with you. And I'll just look at the chat screen as we're going along. So if you've already attended the intro webinar and completed the survey, SurveyMonkey, oh, okay. Sorry, Linda, I'll actually get that fixed straight away for you. That's fine. That's just a little hiccup, and I can change that in the settings to make multiple accesses possible. I'll do that as soon as I get off the webinar. Yep, done that.
Kerry, I just had one thing I was going to mention, if that's okay. As a teacher, you're always mindful of, are there going to be any awkward moments in this film that I need to be prepared for? And in terms of the content, I would say that it's no issues. There's some sad stuff and some heavy stuff, but some emotional stuff, but no scenes that shouldn't be seen. In terms of language, and even in the translation into language, I think there's only one phrase that's kind of perhaps, just became, I'll pop it in the chat screen so, just so that you're aware that it's coming. In terms of age suitability and teacher in the classroom, I think just good to have the heads up. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Kylie. So anybody have any questions that they'd like to direct to Josh, Kylie, or myself? Thank you so much for, as I was saying at the beginning, this is such a busy week for everyone that we've had quite a significant number of live participants for this webinar. So that has been magnificent. So thank you for taking the time. I will send an email with the feedback survey link and the recording. And we'll sign off now and say thank you and goodbye.